Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Agilistry and QA Meetup Group. I'm Lynn Christensen Esker, your host for today. Thank you, everyone, for attending and joining us. As you know, obviously, we're holding a webinar today in the place of an in-person meetup. Please check back with meetup.com for future events. We do have a full schedule of great meetup speakers this year. In addition, I'd like to tell you all about another webinar put on by our sponsor, QASource, on March 27th, entitled The Future of API Testing, Trends and How to Propel Your Testing. Please visit the events section of QASource.com for more information or to register. The emails you've received in regard to today's event also includes the registration link. I'm excited today to have our speaker, Melissa Tondi, joining us from Denver, Colorado in the U.S. today for our program, Make the Shift to Quality Engineering. This is a popular presentation that she is doing, and it's great to be able to offer this information to you today in our meetup. A little bit about Melissa. She is a testing and QE expert and a frequent conference speaker. She has spent most of her career working within software testing teams, but found that it gave her a unique view to the overall SDLC. She is the president of Software Quality Association of Denver and director of quality engineering at EMS Software, where she assists teams to continuously improve the pursuit of quality software from design to delivery and everything in between. In her software test and quality engineering careers, Melissa has focused on building and organizing teams around three major tenets: efficiency, innovation, and culture, and has created the greatest common denominator approach for determining ways in which team members can assess, implement, and report on day-to-day activities so the gap between need and value is as small as possible. You'll be able to submit questions to Melissa today using the chat feature on the webinar control panel. Enter your questions in the dialog box, and Melissa will address them at the tail end of her presentation. So without further ado, let me turn the presentation over to Melissa for Make the Shift to Quality Engineering. Hi, everyone, Melissa Tondi.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited. I love this meetup group. I've done a couple of other sessions and webinars over the last couple of years here, so I'm very excited to roll out this content around making the shift to quality engineering. And as always, a lot of the content that I eventually wind up speaking on are real life situations. And so they're kind of a culmination of both my personal and professional experience working with companies and consulting, and as well as getting feedback from people who have either attended my sessions or that I've networked throughout the year. So this has been a really popular topic because many people ask the question, well, what's the difference between software testing or quality assurance and quality engineering? And I've written a couple of articles that kind of go into detail. And so what I want to talk a little bit about today are the components that go into making that shift to quality engineering. So here are the top 5 things that we're going to discuss over here for the next little while you're listening to me, and then hopefully while we answer and collaborate on questions later. But really, this all kind of started because I've felt, and as many others have felt, that quality assurance has kind of gotten maybe a little bit of a bad rap over the last few years. And that's because quality assurance generally has meant something maybe slightly different from leadership to individuals that take part in quality assurance teams. And it really kind of took on a definition that was, in my opinion, kind of a culmination of different misperceptions. So I like to say that QE is the new QA. And I've made a choice over the last 9-10 years or so of organizations that I've either helped build or that have transitioned and transformed into quality engineering, that even the name change in and of itself opens enough dialogue that it at least gets the questions going and maybe busts some of those misperceptions around quality assurance and quality engineering. So we'll talk a little bit about not only what quality engineering is, but more importantly, what it isn't. And then as we move into the continuous everything, we think about continuous testing, continuous deployment, continuous improvement, all of the continuous items that DevOps and some other more innovative ways to deliver software have come around in the last couple of years. QE is really set up to be able to support some of the more innovative ways in order to build and deliver software, always taking into account the automation of the right things, not just necessarily the tests, but the automation of those repetitive tasks that tend to get in the way of continuous deployment and moving into a DevOps world. So if you are currently adopting some of the DevOps approaches, or you know that your company is looking at doing that, quality engineering really sets up so that we can be more efficient and support some of those newer and innovative ways to deliver that software. And then we'll move into kind of some of the traits and the skill sets to consider when we make that shift into quality engineering. So, when I'm asked a lot to answer questions around what's the future of quality assurance and where should we be looking from our industry, I really like to do that shift from quality assurance into quality engineering. So as we talk a little bit here, of course, I'd love to hear your feedback via the questions, and we'll hopefully be able to get to all of your feedback or questions at the end. But I'd also like for you to kind of consider what is your role now as quality assurance or quality engineering, and taking in my opinions of what I believe it is and what I believe it isn't. I'd love to hear your feedback on that as well. So let's talk about this. So when I go into the misperceptions of quality assurance, these three things, and there are many more, but these are the three items, these line items are what I tend to see in just about every company that is either trying to transition into quality engineering or has maybe an older school or archaic in some cases view of what quality assurance's role is. So we look about here that one of the biggest misperceptions is that there's one team that owns quality, and hopefully you are chuckling when you hear that, because every time I make that statement live, I hear lots of chuckles. Of course, we as professionals know that there's not one team or an individual that owns the quality of what we are building. I like to say that QE or even QA is a cog in the wheel of the SDLC. And although the name quality or the title of quality is usually in our role and in our teams, sometimes that misperception has others who may not be familiar with what we do assume that we are responsible for the quality of the product. And so if you look at the third bullet item, we still see this in a lot of companies where if an issue is found live or by a user, the fingers usually get pointed back to the QA or the software testing team. And of course, as you know, there are lots of indicators of poor quality that we need to be paying attention to. We own the quality of the work that comes out of the quality engineering team, but not necessarily the quality of the overall product that we are building, especially in cases where we may not be able to control the individual team or individual quality measures that happen to the left of us. And of course, the second bullet point, I hope that this will be one of the last times I need to include this, but even just recently, one of the biggest misperceptions is that it's not a skill. And I like to use that quote, anyone who is a user can test, right? And so if you've heard me talk a little bit about a couple years ago, I was talking on a popular topic about shifting the pendulum, from QA, and I kind of walked through the timeline of the last 20 years or so of our industry. And many of us, myself included, started out in quality assurance and software testing because I was a user of the product, and that naturally made me test as if I was a user. And so a while ago, good users could certainly get into quality assurance in its infancy, or at least in its mainstream infancy, by doing that. But when you fast forward to where we are now, and certainly within the last 5 years, simply understanding how the product is supposed to be used is one of many skill sets that quality engineers need. So hopefully, like I said, we'll be dispelling that misperception shortly, and I'll never have to include that again. But the reality is now that sometimes our role as quality assurance and moving into quality engineering is not understood to be a skill set. It's up to us certainly to be able to fine tune and hone our skills, specifically from the technical standpoint. But these are a lot of the misperceptions that seem to be somewhat pervasive in a lot of companies, and even now, I still, I still meet these as challenges. So one of the goals that I have is to, and not to use what I consider an overused word already, but to evangelize the value of quality engineering, so that we can put these misperceptions hopefully to bed. And I'd encourage you, if you do have any other misperceptions of quality assurance that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear those. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this content is not only my experience, but also feedback and conversations that happen from people who, I have the ability to talk with in there. So I'd love to hear what other misperceptions of quality assurance that you may be experiencing now or have recently in the past, so that I can add to the slide. I'd love to be able to dispel all of them. So now let's move into quality engineering, what it is. This is very much, I've kind of fine-tuned this definition over the last 9 or 10 years here. But the best way that I can say is that we really emphasize the engineering piece of it. And those 6 items before that, define, design, build, execute, measure, and report. Those are 6 main characteristics of engineers. They define and design first, and they usually measure in between those, and then they actually build the solution, and then they execute that solution, always keeping in mind that measuring the results and things that are happening in between should be done with the whole team in mind. One of the biggest things that I think that we've sometimes miss in our overall solution when we put together a strategy or a plan for testing is how we're going to measure those results, and specifically having those conversations with our counterparts in product, in development, in DevOps, in release, anyone that's what we call the pillars or the amigos within an agile project team. We really want to make sure that the measurements and the reports of the outcomes that come out are not only understood by those that are actually executing the work, but the team members themselves. Because if at the end of the day, we are siloed of how we're measuring and how we're reporting on outcomes and success, we've missed a big component of the overall success of an agile project team. So, but these 6 strategies have really kind of blended their way, and I emphasize that whenever I'm hiring or transitioning people from more traditional quality assurance or software testing teams into quality engineering. And I think using, when we look at the define, we want to make sure that the success and outcome are completely understood by, again, not only the QE team or the person that's actually building and executing the solution, but that it provides value across the team. And we do that in a variety of ways. We tend to use the term shippable or definition of done in here. And when we say that, what we're saying is that when we move something, specifically if you're using a tool such as Jira or TFS to manage your work from an agile project team, when we move that card from in test or in verification to done, we are committing to these 6 characteristics in everything that we do. And the measurement and reporting of all of those is what actually proves that what we said was going to happen is going to happen. So I would certainly, if you don't have that kind of engineering mindset, these 6 characteristics are characteristics that I would encourage you fine-tuning and having an equal balance across, because just by using those 6 characteristics, it makes developing that plan and strategy much more efficient and productive, and again, showing value across the team, not just the people who are responsible for executing that outcome. So again, what else is quality engineering? I really like this quote. When we use these two other bullet points, balancing technical acumen with user advocacy, which again, if you've heard any of my other talks or read any of the articles that I've published over the last couple of years, a quality engineer understands that the balance of technical acumen, being early adopters of technology, as well as user advocacy, really kind of shifts the pendulum towards the middle. And this is really what we want to be as we move into the future of what quality engineering is that we understand the tools and technology available to us. We are technically savvy to be able to put analytical and critical thinking skills into those solutions. But at the end of the day, we're always advocating for the user, unlike any other person on our team has the skill set. So if we have too much technical acumen and not enough user advocacy, what we tend to see on production or live are user experience issues or degradation in the actual user's experience. And if you move over to the other side where we put too much emphasis on user advocacy and not enough on the technical acumen, we find more pervasive issues such as security or database issues that could have been found using that kind of more balanced technical acumen. And of course, context driven. Not only given the information that we have, which generally comes out within acceptance criteria, user stories, business requirements, user requirements, all the information that the team has to distill and create their solutions. That's quite honestly the easy stuff. We should all be able to distill that information. Context driven really opens up not only the information that is explicitly available to us, but information that is implicitly or not even known available to us. Context driven means that we are gathering that information and we are doing what we can do given the information that's handed to us, but that we have enough critical and analytical thinking skills to gather that information that was either implicit or not given to us at all. So if you add up those two bullet points, I like to use this quote, quality engineering, when we know that we are quality engineers, we have much more influence in the building of the software before the software is built. And that is a really important gauge because lots of times, and this happens every day, even in my organization, sometimes our developer counterparts get a head start on starting work before it's fully refined. Maybe there's that one-off conversation that happens between a business analyst and a product owner and that developer, and the next thing you know, the solution is being built without it fully being vetted out. We know that we provide value as quality engineers when we are so valuable to the team that work wouldn't be started without us really having a seat at the table, refining and grooming that work to the point where we're talking about how we're testing, we're talking about how the users are going to be using it or how they have used it in the past to ensure that we're not having any user experience degradation. And so when we continue to provide that value, dev will know that work really shouldn't start until we've been able to vet that all out. So when we know when we're done, or we know that we've met that utopian approach of being quality engineers and showing that value within our SDLC, it's when we're influencing that software before the software is built. So if you take one thing out of this webinar, I would encourage you to think, what can you do as a professional to influence that software before it's built? Because of course, as you know, and as we've probably seen, the graphs that have existed for probably 15 plus years, those bugs get more expensive to fix the further right those bugs are found within our SDLC. So if you work your way from production, of course, a production issue that is found by a customer that needs to be fixed immediately is one of the most expensive bugs. But if you find those bugs or issues before the software is built, you can see how cheap, and not to necessarily use that term, but you can see how cheap, productive, and efficient it is to consider those issues before that software is being built. So I would encourage you to always use context-driven approaches. Again, not only the information that's explicit, which should be the easiest information since it should be centralized and known by the project team, we really provide the most value when we start sniffing around information that was not as apparent or explicit in some of our normal Agile ceremonies. So we do that in our organization by increasing the collaboration with dev within our PO organization. And sometimes even within our QE team. And I'll talk a little bit about what we've done and what I've done in other organizations in the past that have been very valuable, and that what I call the fresh eyes approach there. We've also branched out who we're talking about. Support, if you have a full-blown technical support or help desk team, and if you're not meeting regularly or talking with them regularly, we're missing a really big piece of data on how users are actually interacting with our software real time. We've found that simply by looking at the tickets that support is generating on the day-to-day or weekly, we have a better pulse on how our users are actually interacting with our software. And what we do is we do a gap analysis between that, and we're continuously improving and expanding the tests that we wind up writing for future releases. And if you have the luxury of being able to speak to customers directly, of course, you can ask those questions without necessarily having that middle person, such as product or other customer-facing teams that are within your company. So if you haven't tapped into support and customers or other customer-facing teams within your company, I would certainly encourage that. What we did at the beginning of this year is we actually went to some of our solutions consultants and professional services folks, the people who are working with customers on the day-to-day, and we actually went through exercises where we showed them how we are testing flows and product within our product lines and components, and we realized that there was a gap between how pre-sales or implementations of our software were actually happening. So if we hadn't reached out to those customer-facing teams before then, we would have missed queue for automation. So expand your mind, use context-driven approaches to gather that information. Just don't go off of what has been just community. There's this gauge, now that I consider that they're probably less years of my career working than there was before. Every QA, I would know more meetups like this and more reaching out to people who you consider thought leaders or industry leaders. They're going to give you a different perspective on how their company or they themselves have solved a challenge that you might be trying to solve. It's always, we never want to reinvent the wheel in these cases. So look outside of how we traditionally gather information and see where you can expand your information using these context-driven approaches. So then we go into quality engineering, what it isn't. And again, these are pervasive. I think this kind of goes back to the misperceptions of quality assurance here. But it's really important. Anytime I start or consult with companies, I make sure that this is very much known. This actually follows a slide deck that I've taken with me for the last 3 or 4 companies that I've been in. Because sometimes, as I had mentioned earlier, the misperceptions may be by a leader, an executive leader, a VP, director, that might have had maybe a different understanding of what quality assurance or software testing is. And I like to start out kind of heavy on this, because I say, if you think that quality engineering or quality assurance are the mistake finders, you will quickly be disappointed, because that's certainly not our role. And any time that we are put in that situation where we are mistake finders, and so that means that somebody to the left of us didn't do their own quality checks. When we find ourselves in that position of being mistake finders, that means that there's something that we should have been doing in our own quality checks that may get left on the table. I mean, there's really only two options there. Something has to get dropped, or we have to add more time or bandwidth, which sometimes we don't have the luxury of doing. So be clear if you are currently in that shift from QA to QE, or if you are looking for a role with as a quality engineer. It's really important to understand what this job isn't and what this role and responsibility isn't. We're not the mistake finders. We're also not the catch-all for failed processes. And this is a hard one. And I'll be, I've seen this even as innovative as I've tried to be in the last 8, 9, 10 years of my career of moving into quality engineering. I still find that there's not a lot of discussion around what happens when a process to the left of us fails. Whose responsibility is it really to fix that? And of course, in our world, we always want the person who signed up to do it, when they're publicly acknowledging their own quality measures, such as unit testing or code review, or demoing the AC to their peers. If one of those processes fails, what happens and who is ultimately responsible for finding that? And so bullet point 1 and 2 really kind of go hand in hand, because if we don't have that conversation, and if QE or QA is the perception is that they are that team, then our value of what we really should be spending our time on diminishes every time that we have to find ourselves in one of these two areas. And of course, that quality engineering should never be the only testing that is happening within the SDLC. There again are quality checks that we expect happening to the left of us from the product owner or UX designer who are writing up requirements and acceptance criteria and user stories. The UX designer is putting low res or high res wireframes in, all the way to dev, and all of our other counterparts within the SDLC. We expect them to want to deliver high quality, and when they don't, that should not be the responsibility of the QE or the QA team. So having that conversation that everyone is responsible for testing their own things. We will certainly test the software, but having that being the only testing that happens within the SDLC is really doing a disservice to not only the quality engineering team, but also the overall project team and the SDLC. So we've all heard the continuous X, right? So continuous testing, continuous integration, continuous deployment. There's all sorts of continuous isms that have been introduced specifically with DevOps, but some of the more innovative ways to approach the SDLC. With that said, when our role as quality engineering, as we shift that, really is to set up in a well thought out way to support that. So when we talk about continuous testing, I like to use the term ABT, always be testing, and of course that doesn't necessarily happen all the time. But if we use that, one of our greatest values is when we are testing and being able to provide that feedback on the state of the software at any given time when it's in our hands. So some of the creative ways that we've done that is by doing bug bust, right? And so We've done this where every 2 weeks or so, we take an hour out of everybody in the department or team's day. Usually could be sometime over lunch or at the end of the day, where we do an hour, and the project team, the QE team or the QE lead for that particular product line that we're going to be bug busting, will set out a charter and areas that we should be following, and it really becomes an exploratory user-based testing around those product lines. And for an hour, an hour every, whatever the frequency is, we try and do it every 2 weeks or so. By doing that, the number of bugs that we find that are really tied to the user experience has been phenomenal. We've actually done quite a bit of we've provided a ton of value on the overall design of the product just by having fresh eyes outside of that project team that's looking at that code and software day in and day out. By just having new eyes on that from another QE team has given us just a really great number and value of reports, so that we can deep dive and make sure that our eyes, that the QE team that's responsible for that product line, that our eyes don't get skewed in there. So I really like to do bug busts, and for an hour a day or an hour every 2 weeks or so, it's pretty inexpensive way to get a lot of value in a short amount of time. So if you don't do something like that, certainly consider that. And we also do, and kind of going in there, the bug busts are generally going in and kind of looking at bugs that have been uh, so that we can always guarantee that instant feedback. So as we move through the check-in and deployment process, the first priority of things that get automated are our unit and integration tests, which if you go back a couple slides when I talked about, we're not responsible, QE is not responsible for making sure somebody left of us did their job. They are. So if their agreement is that they will generate unit and integration tests, we tie that to shippable. And we say that the project isn't really considered or should not be considered successful if we don't have these unit and integration tests automated and executed upon every check-in and merge. So that's the first priority that we look in when we look at always be automating. The second one is that smoke test. And if you're familiar with the ISTQB glossary, which I always have up, I always use that glossary of terms to level set so that we don't mistakenly have a definition that one person believes is correct versus another person. We always go back to that ISTQB glossary. We look at prioritizing the next set of automation around the smoke tests. And in our world, we tie a smoke test that anything broken within that smoke test would generally cause a hot fix if it was released into production, right? So we're really looking at what is the most important functionality that always must be working. And then we prioritize our automation based off of that, never usurping the priority one. It is very serial in motive, so that the P1 tests get automated first, the P2 tests get automated second, and then the P3 tests get automated third. And if anything is broken to the left of that cycle, that usurps any automation that may be happening at that time. We always want to make sure that we're tying the most valuable and critical tests to the ones that are most likely to cause any havoc if something is broken. So we really try to always keep a pulse on what is being automated and how valuable those are. So in our organization, the smoke test is something generally that happens at the second rate of priority, and that generally happens within our existing quality engineering team. And that's executed upon every merge in our pre-production deployments and environments. And they also are run either at will or ad hoc, but certainly tied to deployments and merges. And we move into our third priority. So as we're talking about continuous deployment and being able to support DevOps or DevOps approaches, we go into the user advocacy. And this is really where reaching out to those other teams, such as support or anyone that's having day-to-day interactions with customers or users or potential customers, that we're tying user advocacy flows to those. And so we generally do those, and that these are kind of a priority one from a product or from the business. And you know, ideally a severity and a priority are linked. So if you open up a Sev 1, that would generally mean a priority 1, but in some cases that's not necessarily true. So in that way, we tie and make sure that our user advocacy is automated, it's running on a recurring basis, and that it aligns with the business needs, and it's aligned with how our users are actually using our software versus how we think they're going to use our software. So, and then we move into continuous improvement. Everyone should be continuously improving. This is not something that is tied to only to quality engineering. I would expect every team and person would always look at, you know, improving what they're doing. So what we do is we try and tie these to retrospectives as much as possible. And in cases where it's not necessarily applicable or valuable to bring it up in the retrospectives, the committee with myself in our quality engineering teams, we are reviewing our processes at least on a quarterly basis to make sure that they're going okay, that they're actually providing the value that we thought that they would provide. And if anything needs to change, we quickly are able to respond and deploy and change that when needed. So simply putting in a process for process sake is not what we're going for. We're going for the right process that meets the needs, that show value to most, if not all, of the project team members. And we're quickly able to change that, either add to it or remove items that no longer provide value. We're able to do that, and we put it upon ourselves to continuously look at that on a recurring basis. So as we move into kind of shifting the role, some of the traits to consider, and I kind of mentioned this earlier on, is that first and foremost, whether you're a tester, whether you're a quality assurance professional, quality analyst, quality engineer, somebody that is responsible for testing software, you are a technologist, which means that you should be both early adopters and embracers of technology. If that is not a trait that you innately have, or that you're not willing to continuously improve and work on, the role of a quality engineer, and I would argue any testing role, is probably not going to be very successful for you. We need to be curious as to what tools and technology exist to help make our day-to-day more productive and more efficient. So traits that you should consider, and if you don't have these already, and again, I'm curious as to what you think about other traits that I may have missed here, be curious. Don't necessarily just ask, how is this supposed to work, i.e. test to the requirements, but what happens if I do this? Simply asking that question as you're either in a, a session-based testing coverage, or you're doing some exploratory testing, or even any other type of scripted testing, asking that question, what happens if I do this, will likely uncover bugs that our users will eventually uncover. And honestly, we kind of, I put old school on here next to the question of where will this break. I remember, many years ago when I was interviewing for, quality assurance roles or software testing roles, one of the biggest characteristics and one of the questions that I was asked almost every time was, why do you like software testing? And the joke would be, well, I like to break things, right? And I still hear that. And over the last several years, sometimes that statement was kind of poo-pooed a little bit, saying, well, that's a little old school. I actually recommend that we go back to that approach, because if we don't know where our software will break or where it will ultimately cause a bad user experience, we're not putting together a comprehensive testing strategy or plan. So I would encourage you to ask that question, where will this break, or how can I break this? Not necessarily maliciously, and not necessarily always coming out of the gate with that mentality, but throughout your testing, you should know the limits of the software, and you should try and break it to that point so that we know where our users' performance and experience is going to degrade. And then with that said, we also, because user advocacy is so high on the list of being a successful quality engineer, not only do we need to think like a user, but we need to act like a user, which means that if you are in any part of a testing team or quality engineering organization, regardless of whether or not you are full-time automating using tools and technology, your ability to interact with the software as much as the users interact will make you a better and more rounded tester. So not only think like the user, but act like that user. Interact with that software as much as you possibly can, so that you get a good pulse on how our users are eventually going to be using that as well. And then, the trait, I think this is not necessarily concentrated to quality engineering, but measured progression, both lateral and vertical. As you make your way and you're looking at exploring new areas of technology, that measured progression laterally within the team, maybe you've gotten much more exposure to your product management team or your business analyst team or devs. That's a lateral move, right? So you're kind of looking across ways to make your lateral progression more robust. In addition to vertical, there should be some sort of progression within your, especially if you've been in your career for, say, more than an associate or junior level, and you've made natural vertical progressions within there. People who are looking to improve themselves and their value are people that automatically have that kind of quality engineering frame of mind. So skills to consider. Again, I've written a couple of articles on the specialist and the generalist roles here, and I believe that there are things around test automation, accessibility, security, and even performance in some ways that we have tended to shy away from those because those have always been specialist roles. I think every 5 to 7 years is a time for organizations and industries to determine whether or not the new and innovative skills that have emerged, whether or not those are something that can be more brought in as a generalist role. So if you are in organizations or companies that tend to have way more specialist roles, such as performance engineer, automation engineer, accessibility, all those different things, and there's not really a way for you to bring some of those characteristics and components into your own testing and quality engineering, we're going to continue to have those specialist roles, and your ability to enhance your own professional development will likely get stifled in those. So think about areas that you can broaden your role that have been more specialist roles and bringing those in as more generalist roles. the three that I'm listing here, automation, accessibility, and security, I've got lots of data and content on areas that you can look at around those. So I'm not necessarily saying that if you were not a performance engineer before this, that you will be a performance engineer tomorrow, but there are things that we tend to have the performance engineers do that we could be perfectly capable of doing with that more instant feedback within the project team. So think about areas that have generally been more specialist skills and see where you may be able to broaden your own experience and skill sets by bringing those in. And again, I'd be more than happy to provide a little bit more data and content around what we've done within teams and organizations that I've been in to bring these more specialist roles back into the generalist quality engineering perspective. So last slide before we move into questions. So the main role is to stifle the misperceptions between what QA's and QE's role is. I tended to move into quality engineering and kind of disrupt the title by emphasizing engineering because it at least gets people talking like, well, why are you now referring to yourselves as QE versus QA? Because those misperceptions have been so pervasive for so long, the name change has started conversations that normally would not have been started before then. Know what QE is, and again, this was my opinion on it. You're going to have your own definitions of what quality engineering is, but most importantly, know what it isn't, because when you are confident in what you aren't doing and what should be done by others, that gets the conversation started as well. In the world of continuous everything, integration, deployment, testing, improvement, things shift left. And that means that we need to shift left as well. And kind of the shifting of that quality engineering role helps us support the continuous everything or isms that are coming about as more emerging and innovative tech approaches to technology come our way. And that's only going to get more and more as we continue to fine tune and develop and innovate ways that we both design, build, test, and deliver software. And then adopt those traits and skills that I mentioned earlier. And with all that said, that is kind of the shift to quality engineering and what I encourage people in my organizations and people that I talk to around quality engineering. So contact information, and I think we'll maybe open this up for questions. Contact information is here. I'd love to hear from you via either the questions that we may have time for, or if you have any specific questions or comments or feedback, feel free to contact me in either one of these forums. So with that said, Lynn, any questions coming about that I might be able to answer?
Yes, we have one. Can you give some examples, or at least one example, of how people have broadened their roles from being a specialist to more of a generalist?
Yeah, so, and again, I'd be happy to share my other slide deck that I speak on this a little bit. It's kind of, it's finding efficiencies in software testing. And actually, I think I did that for the group a little while ago, but around test automation. So we'll just use that as an example because that's usually a pretty hot topic. So it's really hard for people who have not had a lot of coding or any coding or programming experience to just simply start adopting tools and technology around test automation. It's a really hard thing, and I like to say the joke where, several years ago, I was kind of mandated to move everyone from what they were calling manual quality assurance to automated quality assurance. And if you've ever tried to make that transition, you probably know that was a disaster. It doesn't work because there's coding and programming experience that is needed. So what we've done is we've created a kind of a training program approach that so instead of saying you are now going to be automation engineers, we say there are 3 proven areas that we're going to train you on within test automation that will at least give you the foundation to see how likely or how easy you'll be able to make that transition. And we do that by doing it. It winds up being about a 4 to 6 week long course for about an hour a week. And with another hour or 2 hours of kind of homework in between that we kind of build into our overall day and week of scheduling. And we have three main outcomes. First outcome is, can you execute the scripts that are already written? I mean, and this is with a robust quality engineering that has technical capabilities around test automation, kind of leading the helm here. But we say, do you know where these tests are, and can you execute the script? So that's outcome number one. If after those tests, those automated tests or scripts are executed and they're failing, can you troubleshoot them enough to be able to provide data on why they are failing? And then number three is, can you edit those scripts to a certain level with oversight from somebody who has more experience and capabilities around there? Can you edit those scripts so that you're starting to get your feet wet? I have my data, and this is more my subjective data, but pretty good data, has shown that people who are willing to do those three things, they will kind of reduce the stigma around test automation, that's not my job, or that's too technical, I'm not a programmer, all that kind of stuff. And you're getting exposure to test automation simply by going down to the bare minimum or the basic building blocks of what test automation is. And so that is a really good transition. And generally what happens is that we see the people who embrace that, and those generally are people who will then go about expanding their own professional development and skill sets, because they've demystified the stigma around test automation being too hard, because they've gotten exposure, and then they kind of take it from there. And next thing you know, they've deepened their own technical capability by simply tying them to those three very simple and easy outcomes. For people who don't, they tend to not really go very far in their career because they're technically averse and aren't willing to invest some of that time. So we try and make it easy, but as the old saying goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make that horse drink. So that's one of the ways that we've done that. I think we're good. I appreciate everybody's time and your attention to this. And like I said, if you have any questions, please take down my contact information. I appreciate everybody's time, and I hope everybody has a good rest of the day.
We'll be putting the video of this meetup online in about a week or so check back at meetup.com for the link to that and to see about future meetup events. You can also check our blog on or after February 28th for a roundup of this program. Thank you, Melissa, for presenting such a great program.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience for joining the Agilistry and QA Meetup Group today for Make the Shift to Quality Engineering. And once again, we invite you to QASource's upcoming webinar, The Future of API Testing, Trends and How to Propel Your Testing, on March 27th. Check QASource.com/news-events for more information. Thank you all, and enjoy your day.